All right, welcome to Lifeline versus Obstacle, a discussion about private educational choice programs and special needs students, special education. My name is Tim Keller. I'm a senior attorney at the Institute for Justice, and in that role, I've had the great pleasure of representing numerous families of children with special needs who rely on school choice programs to give their kids the best possible or best available education. And so in my experience, school choice has been a genuine lifeline for the families that I've represented, the families that I've worked with. In the 2016-2017 school year, there were 56 educational choice programs operating in 25 states. And 20 of those programs serve primarily students with disabilities or provide students with disabilities some additional considerations, such as additional dollars deposited into their education savings accounts, for example. There are three different ways, generally speaking, of delivering private educational choice, and so I'll just lay those three out briefly. Number one is what we would call a traditional scholarship program. This is where we give families public funds in the form of a warrant or a check or a voucher to take and use towards either full or partial payment of tuition at a private school. The second way would be to encourage private donations to scholarship organizations by giving individuals a tax credit or corporations a tax credit for their donation to those private scholarship organizations, and those private scholarship organizations award scholarships to students, again, to attend the private school of their choice. So these two types of programs really are school choice programs. But in 2011, a new innovation was born, education savings accounts. And so this is the third way, and it's been proven increasingly popular throughout the country. And so with an ESA program, what happens is the state deposits typically around 90% of what the state would have spent on that student in a public school into a parent-controlled account, and the parents can spend the dollars in that account in an a la carte fashion to truly individually tailor an educational program for their students. ESA programs don't require that families be enrolled in a private school. Instead, they can use any of the various means that are approved by the ESA program to provide their child with an education. And most of the ESA programs operating in the United States today are primarily reserved for students with special needs. Although there is one program that is not funded in Nevada that is truly universal in scope, and Arizona's program, which we'll talk a little bit about, also affords opportunities for children in failing schools, children of military families, children on Native American reservations, a couple other categories to participate as well. So that's the landscape in private school choice. But why are we here today? Well, in recent months, private school choice programs that primarily serve students with disabilities have come under increasingly withering criticism. In major publications like the New York Times, there have been articles criticizing private school choice programs, saying that the families who are participating in those programs are losing their rights under the federal Individuals, Disabilities, and Education Act, IDEA, that these programs are harming public schools, and that parents are not being adequately informed under these programs, and that they simply don't provide enough funding for families to choose the type of educational services and goods that they need in order to provide their kids with an adequate education. And so those are the charges that have been leveled. Like I said, in my experience, these programs have been a genuine lifeline for families. So we've brought together a panel of experts to talk about what it means to give students with disabilities genuine choice in education. And so we're going to turn it over to our esteemed panelists. I will introduce them briefly. Their full bios are in your materials. They're on the app, so I'm not going to read them in their entirety. But then after I introduce the panel, I will sit down, and after they've given their remarks, I may exercise my prerogative as the moderator to ask a few questions, but then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience as well, and we'll just see how time goes, whether I get my opportunity to ask the questions or not. So first, we're going to hear from Robin Sweet. And Robin and I have known each other since 2006, when Arizona passed its first program for kids with special needs in 2006. We have been working, fighting, battling alongside one another for many years to advance educational choice in Arizona. Robin is the founder of the Gateway Academy, a school that serves twice exceptional students. These are students who are both gifted academically and also have Asperger's syndrome. She is also, she says most importantly in her bio, the mother of a son who has Asperger's syndrome. Then we're going to hear from Senator Mike Lee in North Carolina. Senator Lee was elected in November of 2016 to the North Carolina Senate, and he was the primary sponsor of North Carolina's newly enacted Education Savings Account program. And so we'll hear from him about what it took to be on the front lines to get that program passed and why he was passionate to fight that battle in North Carolina. Then we'll hear from Annette Lizardo. She is on the Gardner Scholarship Parent Advisory Council. The Gardner Scholarship Program is Florida's ESA program. And she's got children who have participated in numerous school choice programs in Florida and also attended public schools. And so she's going to give us her view as a parent and an advocate of the benefits of providing families with a broad range of educational choices. And then finally, we've got Sivan Tushman. Close enough?
Yeah.
All right. She's a research analyst at the Center on Reinventing Public Education. She studies how educators and families experience the implementation of innovative policies and programs in K-12 schools and systems that support them. And she's written recently on the topic of private educational choice and special needs kids, and we'll hear her perspective as a researcher on these programs. So with that, I'll turn it over to Robin, and we can just move down the line.
Fabulous. Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure being here with everybody today. I am the Executive Director and CEO of Gateway Academy in Phoenix, Arizona. We're a K-12 school for children that are twice exceptional, and our definition is they're academically bright, and they all have level 1 autism spectrum disorder, which is why they had a mutiny and made me change it to twice exceptional. So they all have Asperger's syndrome. I started Gateway with my husband, who was a president and chancellor of different colleges and universities. Our son was diagnosed with Asperger's at the age of 10 after he was kicked out of 2 kindergartens. We tried private school, we tried public school, we tried homeschooling, and then eventually came to the realization we needed to start our own program. And we did that in California and then moved 6 years later to Arizona, which I was fortunate enough to meet Tim. And we started with 6 students, and we are now at 95 students. And the reason behind the exponential growth is the Empowerment Scholarship. It has helped our families from all socioeconomic groups, from all ethnicities, to be able to take the Empowerment Scholarship, which typically pays for 90% of the tuition, but and it's based on the eligibility category on the student's individual education plan. And so if they have autism, they are actually paying full tuition for Gateway Academy and any other private day in the Arizona area, which is amazing. So it opens it up to everybody. And we have a very unique environment where the students feel safe, they feel heard, they feel supported. These are the kids that are bullied, teased, and tortured in your traditional public school system. Let's see. In 2011, the ESA program expanded to include all disabilities, which is pretty phenomenal. Why the attacks on school choice? Typically, it's misinformation that's frightening parents. I was just telling Tim that our parents are freaking out because we're trying to expand school choice in Arizona to include all students so that all families can have the opportunity to place their child in the best academic environment. But the expansion doesn't include getting rid of the special education component. But the people that are against the empowerment scholarship being expanded are putting fear factor out there, and so they're trying to frighten the families that their ESA is going to be taken away from them. And for the first time in their lives, and the first time in their children's lives, they're successful, they're doing well. And how frightening is that as a parent once you know that your child is excelling, which they should be, it's going to be taken away from you. So everybody's trying to get the word out that it does not impact the special ed community. They also suggest that ESA only benefits the wealthy. That doesn't make sense to me at all. It is an opportunity for all families with children with special needs. Again, the funding is allocated due to the specific disability. So autism tends to get the most funding. And with that said, it allows parents of all socioeconomic groups to be able to place their child in whatever special ed private day school that they feel is the right fit for their child. The other misnomer is that ESA is taking money away from public schools. And so the teachers are frightened that they're going to be losing their jobs and public schools are going to crash and burn. The reality is, I believe it's like 0.1% of the student population are being affected by the ESA. And so it's not going to impact the public schools. The facts are that any parent of a child with special needs who has an IEP and 100 days in a public school qualifies for the empowerment scholarship. It's that simple. It has nothing to do with your financial situation. It doesn't have anything to do with your zip code. It's just a genuine gift to a lot of families who have been struggling, who their children have been struggling. ESA funding is allocated to educate each individual student, not a particular school. So I think a lot of misinformation is that the funds go directly to the school itself, and that's not true at all. It goes directly to the parent, and then they can pick and choose where they want those funds to go. They can go for therapies, they can go for education, they can go for homeschooling. So it really empowers the parent to find truly and genuinely the best academic environment for their child. The public school funding the public school funding is about $20,000 on average for a child with special needs. And unfortunately, in a public environment, those special ed dollars go into the general fund. They don't go into the special ed fund. And a lot of people don't know that. I didn't know it until not that long ago, and that's frightening. Then the ESAs allow parents to allocate their children's dollars to enroll in a school that best serves their child's particular needs. So whether it's autism, whether it's learning disabilities, whether it's behavioral issues that are, stem from a clinical diagnosis. It's very, very important for these kids to be able to be supported and in a safe environment. We work very closely with the American Federation for Children and Gateway and a number of other private day schools got involved. Most recently last year, when the ESA was coming under attack, and we had one of our seniors in high school step up and speak to the Senate. And then he did such a great job, they want him to go on and speak to the legislators about what the ESA means to him. And this young man came from a very low income, father's in jail, mom is kind of in and out of the house, and without the ESA, he wouldn't have become the valedictorian that he was. And today he's at Grand Canyon University, and I believe that he wants to become a lawyer, God love him.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Lee, and I'm with the North Carolina Senate. And I'm relatively new to the North Carolina Senate, although one of my colleagues in the back of the room will tell you that's not true. I was elected in 14 and then again in 16, so I'm in my second full term, and we have 2-year terms. The reason I continue to say that I'm new is that although I have a passion for education and always have, I was not on the Education Committee until just January of this year, and I was also made a co-chair. So I am relatively new to the official role, even though with my wife and our 4 children, been pretty passionate about it for quite some time. I'm going to start this out with a survey, if that's okay. How many of y'all are parents? Raise your hand. Doesn't matter how old the kids are. Okay. How many of y'all are legislators? Raise your hand for me. Okay. How many of y'all are parents of a child with special needs? Okay, and then one more question. There is a test later. How many of y'all have a close friend or around the special needs community with any regularity? Okay, great. So we've got a good representation. So Eric Nesbitt, who's in the back of the room, works on our ed policy, and he did a great job. He pulled together a really neat thing for me to do. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that, Eric. Just trust me, it was really good. And it was going to kind of walk you through our statute and some of those things. I actually, after having met some folks, and kind of want to talk a little bit about our program, not from just a statutory perspective. Legislators, if you're real interested in our statute, you've got really smart folks who can pull it together for you, and I'm certainly willing to answer questions, and we'll kind of weave in some of the specifics as I talk. But, you know, ESA for special needs kids, some folks say, well, that's just a way into Kimmel's nose under the tent. We want ESAs for everyone. And certainly that's not a bad thing. But for me personally, that really wasn't the driving force as to why I'm so passionate about it. And I can't take credit for leading the charge on the policy because y'all know I'm relatively new. So this statute didn't just come about. Our session, by the way, starts in January. Long session is when initial legislation can be introduced. So that just was this year. So I couldn't have gotten to be on the ed committee and a chair and then magically had a statute introduced. So Chad Barefoot, Senator Barefoot, had worked on this, and I know with some other House members in the North Carolina legislature long before I got there. Senator Barefoot, and again, I mentioned I was new, right? He said, do you want to help with this? And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know a lot about it. And when he asked me to help, he said, well, I'm going to put you down as a primary co-sponsor, but just make sure you are comfortable with it. And after I read it, I was really passionate about it. And he put me, and for those of you who are legislators will know, he put me as the first sponsor on the bill, which means that anytime a call came in on the bill, it came to me, which has actually been great for me. My wife and I have 4 children, and my oldest son is at the School of Science and Math, which is the first residential school in the United States, public residential school in Durham, North Carolina. It's an acceptance program, junior, senior year. My daughter is a sophomore at a traditional public high school. It's been awesome. She loves it. My 8th grader is at a private middle school, and my youngest 11-year-old is in the 4th grade, and he is in a traditional public the first part of the day, and then he's in a special needs school the second part of the day. There was a comment, if you attended the ESA pre-conference seminar yesterday, there was a question that was asked, are there any instances where a child is enrolled in traditional public and can qualify for the ESA program? And I think the answer was that there was no program in the U.S. that was like that, but there is now, because that's what we passed in North Carolina, and it was specifically to cover that instance where where there is a program where a child can get a half day of English, math, primarily English and math, for a half day while getting science, PE, and some of the others in the other part of the day. So it's a really neat program, and it really works for our son. And when we were crafting, when I say we, when we were kind of revising the legislation, that really wasn't taken into account because no one really knew much about this particular school. But I'll tell you, aside from what you've heard already about why ESAs are important, there's something that people aren't thinking about as to why it's critically important. Is because, well, let me just take my district, for example, or the city I live in. I live in a city of 100,000 people, give or take. How many of the children are in my community with special needs is a certain number. How many of the kids in our community that have special needs that have enough money to send their children to a private special needs school is a much smaller number. So you can't get the scale necessary to open up a school designated to children with special needs unless you've kind of got this part-time program, very small school. What an ESA does is it will create markets, because then every parent of a child that has an IEP in my city will have the ability to take $9,000 if they qualify for the ESA, and to qualify you need to have an IEP. They can take that $9,000 and see if there's enough volume or number of parents to create the scale so that you can have the services. In North Carolina, we have something called a disabilities grant, which I believe is $8,000 a year. It's a little different. But what the ESA does is it allows the disability grant at $8,000 and the ESA of $9,000 are stackable. So in certain instances, you can qualify for both and have $17,000. There are private schools in the Triangle, Raleigh-Durham area, large metropolitan area, in Charlotte, North Carolina, that have private schools designated for children with special needs. But those are about where the tuitions are. What the tuition is, it's around $17,000, $18,000. And because I did not have a planned presentation, if I run on my 10 minutes, you can just throw something at me. So, you know, this concept of creating a market is really where some of these services can come into play that just currently aren't there. The ESA is different than our disabilities grant. The disabilities grant goes away if you don't use it. It's reimbursable unless there's a deal with the school where there's a direct tuition. It was an agreement with the state so you can pay tuition directly. The ESA is funded quarterly through a debit card, and there are lots of reasons for it. I'm not going to get into all the rigmarole that people have complained about, because I want to get to this point. The idea that the funds can be rolled over is critically important. For those of you who have special needs children, you know your kids might miss a lot of school some years, but not in others. My child missed probably about 6 weeks of school, 7 weeks of school one year because of surgeries that he had to go to Cincinnati for, and we live in North Carolina, wasn't close. He has to miss school for 2 weeks coming up in a month because he's got to have another surgery. There are some years where you're going to miss time that you're really going to have to make it up in the summertime and in the next year. So the concept of funds being able to be rolled over gives a whole nother flexibility that a parent with a typically developing child just can't even fathom. The concept of the debit card, I'm not going to go into the objections, but I will go into why it's so critically important for parents of kids with special needs. If you have a child that has special needs that needs any kind of medical services, you can't imagine the volume of mail and health insurance that you have to deal with. You just can't imagine the time expended in just being able to, even if you've got good insurance, So the concept of layering a whole nother process by which you've got to pay and reimburse and track while you're raising a special needs child and taking care of their needs, both cognitive and physical, is really daunting. And if we can make this easier on parents, we absolutely should. I can't tell you, my child gets a shot every day, and it's a vial that comes in the mail, and it malfunctioned. He needs this shot every day. It's a particular hormone, and we couldn't get another vial. I mean, it took a week in order to just get them to agree to replace the vial, and then the vial came when it typically comes every 2 weeks, because that's when it runs out. So that's just one tiny example, and then we're going to have to fight not to have to pay for what we didn't use, and that's a whole nother level. And I can't tell you the frustration that parents have, not just with that, but with the time constraints that you have raising a child with special needs. We've got to make it easier while having accountability, and I think there are many ways to do that, and I'm probably out of time, so thank you.
Hello, excuse me. I'm Annette Lizardo. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would agree with everything the senator just said. I was going to ask how many of you, thank you, did have special needs children or a niece, a nephew, or were just familiar with the ins and outs of a special needs child. Obviously, they're different than 8 hours a day in school. And I have 3 children. I did not bring their picture, even though they are lovely and adorable. My oldest is the Gardner recipient of the ESA. He is 13. He is high-functioning autism, Asperger. At 5, he was initially diagnosed with ADHD. And at 10, we re-evaled. And the neurologist told me it's the most classic case of ADD I've ever seen in my career. I usually don't break up those of you who know me, but my middle one is 11, and he is nonverbal autistic. He gets the McKay Scholarship, and my youngest has a 504. The 2 boys have IEPs. My youngest has a 504 for ADHD, and she also gets the McKay. The reason I mention this, and I have a slide on that in just a minute, but because the amount you can get, it varies so much that it's very specific to each child. But I just did bring a couple slides because of the terminology that we use. Some of you may not be familiar with Florida's programs and some of the terminology I'll be using. But this particular slide is thanks to Catherine Robinson with FPN, Florida Parent Network. She's the organizer. And I saw this slide actually at a meeting. She had like a coffee chat at a charter school that I just happened to go because I wanted to hear what she had to say. And when she used this slide, I was like, wow. Out of those, I think it's 8 different items on there. My children have used 7. So they have been in public school. They have been in private school. They have been in charter schools. One was in a magnet school. The vouchers, it's the FTC in Florida, Florida Tax Credit. We haven't used that one. Scholarships, the educational scholarships, virtual programs, online classes as well, and homeschool. So this is the main reason I'm here, because I've hopped around, as Robin said, trying to find a good fit. And we think of special needs, and instantly, perhaps someone in a chair comes to mind. Those of you who have a family member or a close friend with a child with a special need, it may be what's considered an invisible disability. They look fine, they look great, until you spend a little more time with them. Be it ADD, be it ADHD, be it nonverbal autism. People look at my son and think he's quote unquote typical or normal until they're around maybe 30 minutes or so, and they notice a little behavior or that maybe he doesn't respond to their question. So I wanted you to understand, I love the Gardner. I wish every state was required to have an ESA such as the Gardner, because it would make special needs families so much, it would lighten the load quite a bit. It has opened the door to numerous possibilities, not just what you see here, but also an à la carte education. All these are not mutually exclusive. For instance, my son has had virtual classes, being in a homeschool program, and also had online virtual face-to-face and tutoring. The program, the Gardner website, I think it's a 12-page document of about, it must be at least over 1,000 items that are pre-authorized. That means that a parent can use those funds quarterly for any of those items that are of educational value to your child. So I am pro everything you see on that list. I'm not anti anything because every child is different. Every need is different. And even with my own children, at different ages and stages, they've had different needs. You know, if our typical children are all different from each other, imagine, you know, an atypical or a special needs child. You know, this is why these programs are so important and so necessary. And I have it here, so let me see if I can just go. Yeah, this is my disclaimer. These next three are just from the Florida DOE, actually, that I brought, and there's the link that you can see this information on. But basically, the funding for the Florida school districts for this past year just lays out the three programs that I mentioned. The McKay Scholarship right there, and I just put asterisks beside the requirements. You heard the 100-day in Arizona. For us, it's October to February. That was when my middle one first got diagnosed at 2.5 with autism. That's the first thing I was told. You know, so we know you have to be in a public school in order to get that. The nice thing with the Gardner, and I have that up here now, with the asterisks, is notice that there is no such requirement. That is such a blessing, okay, because it avoids school hopping. If you've moved quite a bit in your life, perhaps it's a little difficult, depending on the age of your child, for them to transition from one school to the next, to a new teacher, to another teacher, to make new friends, et cetera. My oldest was bullied more than once in different school settings. This is one reason we just, you know, I just found out about the Gardner last year. I believe it's in its third year or fourth, and this is our second year with the Gardner. He's a big boy. My husband's over 6 feet tall. You don't think of a puny, sickly child, but again, if you are familiar with some of these disabilities, you know it's not all about size. A lot of it is maybe social awkwardness, you know, maybe a hidden disability where the kids realize, oh, they have dyslexia or dysgraphia or something that I can't see, but I can make fun of them. When I realize that they can't do this or that, why can't they do that? So it's very subtle, unfortunately. So the Gardner has really opened up a whole new world as far as not having to move your child around. And in addition to the a la carte education it provides, and the FTC one is there, which you've heard mentioned, which is the needs-based, if you will. I don't know how to turn that off now. There we go. But I don't think there's anything else. I can't think of anything I didn't say about my children at this point. So thank you for listening.
I'm going to take a much broader view of the national situation going on with school choice. I say school choice, and I include charter schools very much in that conversation. I know Adam in particular wanted me to talk a little bit about an op-ed that I co-wrote with Robin Lake, who was in the back. And actually, it was in response to an article Robin wrote that was passionately talking about her experience with her son and wishing she had had a voucher available. And what I know to be true, having been in special ed as a special educator for many years, is that parents will do anything for their children. And so it doesn't matter what their politics are when it comes to needing to do what's best for their children. Parents want the opportunities to be able to provide their student with the best education possible. We know that private education is totally possible when you're a student with an IEP in the public system. It's already a mechanism that's in place. However, it's district controlled. The districts choose where the students can attend. it takes a very, very long time and actually a lot of money to have the political power within just your family to go through the process, the IEP process of getting a private placement. Having been on both sides, the private school side as well as the public school side, it's difficult, even when you know that as an educator, that's what's best for a student. But I think that there are a lot of realities that exist. You guys all are in very particular states. Each state looks so different from one another in terms of the policy context. Part of that is politics. And part of the politics with students with disabilities is the special ed advocacy community, which is very powerful and is really why we have the protections that we have today for students with disabilities. However, they're real resistant to private school choice, much more open and accepting of charter schools as an option. But I think the problem is that we very often are not framing the conversation about why private school choice is a potential opportunity for students with disabilities in a way that it isn't a door that we necessarily want to close. So you can ask people a lot of times, like, what would you need to do to a private school choice program or any choice program to make it palatable to your political interests? And I very often try to think of how can I make special ed look the way that makes people more comfortable if we were to change this and change that. And I think, you know, there are various things that the people on the panel have really pointed at were important to them as parents or practitioners working with students with disabilities. But I think also making things politically feasible is incredibly important. The IEP, if you don't know, is usually about a 20-page document. I've had to kill a lot of trees printing them. And it is a lot of check boxes. It is writing a lot. When it's not done well, it's very meaningless. And so there are times in which when people say you're losing your rights when you go to a private school, it's kind of a misnomer because of the number of students I've worked with who didn't have rights to begin with, even with the document in their hand. So you kind of have the two ends. You either need to make the IEP process substantially better, or you have to stop holding on to it as the cure-all for ensuring that students have their rights. At the same time, I'm probably the naysayer on the panel, and I do think that you have to have certain provisions in place to ensure that students aren't taken advantage of. I know the true free marketers might say, well, you vote with your feet. If you don't like where you go, you don't like your service provider, you don't like your educator, you can move. But I think we all know that for a student without a disability, the shock, the single year shock in academic achievement from changing schools is pretty substantial. So I think the last thing we want are kids bouncing around, as Annette mentioned for her students. You don't want that to happen. So what are some of the things that we can ensure can happen so that parents go into the school choice decision-making process in a way that they don't have to rely on that IEP to get what they need out of that school, but they can also be making good, informed decisions that are going to enable them to be empowered and have ownership over the education for their students, again, without the paperwork. So I jot down a lot of these things that I think are really important. Different people have different problems with these. I think there was some conversation about funding. I think really important are, I don't believe in top-up. I think top-ups, which means that you can add your own private funding to a voucher or a private school choice program. I think that does lead the way to students with more income being able to have more opportunity. And that just means that if you have the means and a scholarship, not all scholarships are as well endowed as others. So if your private school scholarship, I'll give Louisiana's, which is my F for private school choice programs for students with disabilities, because it gives about $4,500 for a student with a disability to go to private school. It's crazy. Only parents who have money can use that. It's, you know, you're talking about at least $10,000 to $15,000 more that a private education is going to cost for a student with a disability. So, one, if you're going to make a program, fund it well. Two, fund it well and don't allow top-ups so that we can have what I would call equity. But I also think that there are other problems that people really do point out in terms of the enrollment of students with disabilities. The ESAs in particular, I think one of the solutions that a lot of us are really interested in looking more at is how can we make this a true marketplace where parents can get high quality services and not just be left on their own like, oh, I thought this was a good idea, just like me and using like an HSA, if you know, a health savings account. Like I didn't do that because I can't manage that. I can barely manage what I have. So if you basically take an HSA and then say, hey, for your kid with the disability, go find speech therapy in your city. Frankly, I would want some help with that if I was a parent. There are some really great organizations that are starting to do this more and more within the high choice systems, whether it's Ed Navigators in New Orleans or DC School Reform Now in Washington, D.C. I know Step Up is maybe starting that in Florida a little bit. So there are some opportunities for some sorts of supports to be happening, whether they're purely online or creating parent networks so that parents can get together and talk about these things, creating job or listings of different service providers, Yelp sort of systems. I think all of these things need to be taken into consideration. Another argument would often be discrimination. So when we think of how we create these programs, I'm also a huge fan of unified or centralized enrollment systems that do randomly assign students to their schools based on their preferences, not allowing schools to choose who they accept. Because I think especially when you have a general education voucher opposed to one that's specifically for students with disabilities, if all the schools that choose to participate have entrance exams, you're gonna have a 0 participation rate of students who have learning disabilities. So I think that if we really do believe that all students deserve a private education or the kind of education that's gonna be the best fit for them, I think we really have to make them accessible to all kinds of students regardless of their disability. So I think there are a host of different policy mechanisms that need to be taken into consideration when designing private school and public school choice programs to really create equity and maximize the opportunities for students with disabilities.
All right. All right. So there's a microphone. There was a microphone. Did we take the microphone away? Oh, we've got a roving microphone now. So if you have a question, we'll bring the microphone to you. But I'm actually going to take a few moments and just ask a few questions of the panelists since we have a little time for that. So Robin, one of the things that is true with a private school choice program is that when a parent chooses to participate in the program and leaves their public school environment and enrolls in a private school, the IDEA no longer applies to that student in the same way that would have applied had they been in a public school. Right. And one of the requirements under the IDEA is that to the maximum extent possible, students with special needs are supposed to be placed in the least restrictive environment, which generally translates into a general education classroom and maybe pulled out for special education services, but generally placed with students, who, in the case of children with autism, are with their neurologically typical peers. But at a school like Gateway, the students are surrounded by other students with Asperger's syndrome. And so how do you respond to claims that isolating students to be around only other students with Asperger's are detrimental to their long-term learning and educational goals?
It's a great question. For our particular population, children with Asperger's and high-functioning autism, they really need to be around peers because the traditional, typical model doesn't work for them because they don't understand them. Their peers look at them like, you're weird, you're a geek, why are you talking about astrophysics and you're in 5th grade? So with IDEA, our environment is all-inclusive. So we're doing academics, we're doing pragmatic language, so speech language, occupational therapy, which is sensory integration for our students. We do equine therapy, which is being mindful of your environment, learning about nonverbal communication. We do instrumental and digital music. We have a world language lab with 21 different languages. So the environment is a traditional academic environment, but it just has the supports all under one roof that these children need to be independent and ultimately successful.
So there's just one other follow-up. So are most of the students who are graduating from Gateway going on to college? Are they
I'm
going
prou-
straight into the workforce? What sort of
I'm
record?
proud to say
I know the answer.
100%. I know you do. I know you do. 100% have gone on to college, and so we're very, very proud of that, and we nurture that passion from the time they enter Gateway. And these are the Bill Gates and the Ralph Naders of the world, and our kids are either all or none. They're either on the side of the force, as they say, or they're on the dark side. And that's sad and that's scary.
If you ever drop by Gateway, Robin has pictures of all of her graduates hanging up, and she can point to every student and tell you exactly where they went and what degree they're pursuing. It's pretty cool. So,
Thank you.
Senator Lee, I know there's legislators in the room. I'm curious, if there was one or two particularly difficult obstacles that you encountered during the session as you were trying to get the ESA passed, and what course you took in order to get around those obstacles.
Well, so procedurally, what happened was the bill was filed, and then we worked on it, and it got folded into our budget. So it ended up being part of the budget vote. So you would think there'd be a lot of people screaming about that, but oddly enough, there really was no one complaining about it. The first call I got from the press, we adjourned in July. The first call I got from major mainstream press was about a month ago to just talk about it. So it's funny, it's not funny, I guess it's interesting that there wasn't these issues that came out, but there are a lot of issues that we can address, and you were talking about, I think, topping up or whatever the phrase is. There are policy answers to these problems. In North Carolina, we have something called the Opportunity Scholarship, which is a means-based test, not for special needs kids, but for all kids. You could develop a program in your state. So we've got essentially 3 stackable programs: an Opportunity Scholarship, Disabilities Grant, and the ESA. You could theoretically stack all 3 at $21,000, or you can stack just pieces of it. So you can craft a policy to deal with a lot of these issues. Now, our money's capped, so not everyone gets the benefit, but we're starting the program, and I think that's what's so important. Get the program moving, show people that it works and you can get results. So from a policy perspective, that's probably why people aren't jumping up and down and screaming, is because we put $450,000 in the first year to organize it. We've got $3 million in for the next year. Hopefully we'll be able to fund it a lot more. These other programs, Opportunity Scholarships and Disabilities Grant, already funded, so we're just kind of adding to it.
All right. Annette, one of the things that we've talked about a little bit this afternoon is just making sure that parents have adequate information, the tools they need to make the right decisions for their students. Florida has had robust school choice options for their families for years. Many of the states that have recently adopted ESAs are new to the game. Arizona's the exception there, right? But in terms of implementation, what should the folks who are implementing these laws be thinking about in terms of best serving parents? What changes have been made to Florida? What changes could be made in Florida to make the program better serve parents and give them better information so they can make those choices?
Before the program, we were speaking, and educators so far seem to have been the main way for parents to find out about the Gardner. And we were, part of the reason I think is Step Up for Students had the FTC before. So even myself, who I consider myself rather informed to try to stay on top of everything and all the options for my own children, when I found out about the Gardner, the director of the school I was similar to Gateway that I was looking for my son, said, oh, why don't you apply for the Gardner? He would get more. Most of my students get more on that than the other scholarship. And I said, oh, well, we don't qualify for that. That was the first thing I thought. So definitely information, letting the parents know this is not means-based, it's not needs-based, I mean. This is simply based on that criteria, the eligibility criteria of the special needs. And that's on the website, you can see, and I've referred several people to that, those categories. That has prompted a lot of parents to get a diagnosis. Unfortunately, some of you may know, people do not want a label. But unfortunately, to tap into those sources, that label is necessary, even for insurance. So I think that's the first step, is still to this day creating some awareness of what the program is, how do you qualify for it, what you can do with it. And I know Step Up has been great, the Gardner. On the website for the Parents Resources, there is about a document for pre-authorized items and services, therapies included. It's about 12 pages long. Yeah. So literally, even if you don't know what you need, that's going to give you an idea what I can look for. And I think I'm free to say, they're currently working on a marketplace similar to Yelp. That's been discussed, and I think it's a great idea, because you have parents such as myself who have applied and received the Gardner for their child, who we had already been doing therapies, tutoring, et cetera. We had kind of had a little experience in that. However, there are parents who are going to be totally new to it, and they don't know where to turn. So I think there are some Facebook groups as well, that have come around the program, and constantly, I'm seeing questions asked, and did this work, and my child has this, have you heard of this? Did you get this approved? Because it is a reimbursement program. And the main problem, I think, again, which is, and just in my short time within the last couple years, has been a great improvement. It is a reimbursement program. So again, you need to pay for that and then get reimbursed. So the less amount of time between my dishing money out and being able to tap into those funds is critical. And I must say, I haven't had a problem, with that. It could be a few days, it could be a few weeks, depending on what you're seeking approval of the funds for. So really, but from what I've heard, that if it's not a pre-authorized item, because it does need some special scrutiny, and that's a little bit where the accountability comes in. As I'm a parent, but at the same time, the other side, I have to understand the other side. If you make the legislation, I understand there has to be some accountability. And I know, I can't go use my funds to take a, 5-week trip to Paris with my family. So I understand, those are funds that, yes, I have discretion to use, and they're to be used for the educational value of my child. However, they balancing that, how much autonomy for the parent, how much accountability should there be? That's an ongoing discussion, I think, and I think it's a valid one. I understand as a parent, there should be some level of scrutiny, while at the same time, legislatures and administrators should respect my choices. So I think those are the main areas. Cutting down that time for reimbursement is critical, because honestly, a lot of parents, I have 3. There are parents in the program that have more children than I do, and, some with medical issues. If they put money on a card, a credit card to pay for something, they cannot wait, more than maybe a month or two to pay back that money, because they're going to start accruing fees and charges. So I think that, as Siobhan said, if you have a program, it needs to be well-funded, but also keep in mind the parent side. You're at an advantage because you're on the legislator side and you're a parent, so you appreciate those problems. But, cutting that down, at least, to 30 days is really critical, I think, for a parent. And that Yelp system, that marketplace, which is in the works, is also just going to make it an even easier process. I mean, as it is, I must say Gardner is extremely easy to use as far as asking for reimbursement and releasing funds to providers. There are providers who have agreements with them, so they will basically bill you and you just approve the process, as opposed to, for instance, if I buy something, I upload the receipt, and then it goes to their, to their offices for approval to get reimbursed. So there's basically two ways to bill, if you will.
Yeah, and I think Florida's the only program that uses a reimbursement model, and I think that online platform that they're building will go a long way to improving and making the payment process and the reimbursement time a lot shorter. So, Savannah, I have one question for you. It strikes me that opponents of private educational choice tend to paint the situation as a zero-sum game. And yet I think most opponents would admit that there's still a lot of work to be done in our public schools to improve the way we deliver services to kids with special needs. The last statistics I saw was that there were 6.6 million children enrolled in special education, and that constitutes 13% of all public school students. And so in my mind, this is not a zero-sum game. This is not an either-or. This is a both-and. And so are there messages or strategies that we can pursue to work with public school advocates and explain that this is not, an attack on the public schools? This is a means of empowering every parent to find the best available placement for their student.
Yeah, well, I think actually your comment about the fact that there wasn't really an argument, Arkansas passed their voucher with 0 dissent. And I think the comment was also made, this is special education as a way in to private school choice in a lot of states. And there are reasons for that. There are political reasons. You don't have income attached to disability very strongly. You don't have race necessarily attached very strongly, or geography. So there aren't some of these other issues that maybe come up politically for the passage of school choice programs for students with disabilities. But I do think that some of the messaging is we already have private school options for students with disabilities. Number two, it's actually not a zero-sum game. School districts can benefit money. So most private school choice programs are state funds, not local funds. However, most students with disabilities cost above and beyond the amount of money that their public schools are provided to support students with disabilities. So in California, they call it encroachment, in which the special ed funds seep into the general ed funds and steal the money away because the mandate is to provide the services for students with disabilities. So if that student goes to a private school, the state's paying them the state funds, you no longer have the burden of the money that you have to take out of your general ed fund for the students with disabilities, you end up actually with more money. So if you want to put it that way, you totally can. I think though, the thing we have to be most careful about is we have so little evidence on the effectiveness of special education in public schools. We have zero evidence, to mine and Patrick Wolf's dismay, of the effectiveness of special education in private school choice programs. All we know is parents are happy. And frankly, we know that parents are happy whenever they make choices for themselves. So we really do limit any true evidence that students benefit from these programs, but they keep growing. And they grow because there is this demand from people, as well as the reality is, as we know, the alternative is so bad. And so we kind of feel like for kids with disabilities, we might not have as much to lose when we don't have tons of evidence. I don't think that's a great reason to pass legislation, but it might, for politicians, make things a little politically easier to sell.
All right. So we have just under 15 minutes. So what questions do we have from the audience? I see one question there.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Elms with the Children's Education Alliance of Missouri, and we're hopeful that this year we'll have a special needs-based ESA passed out of our legislature. Part of the requirements of what's probably going to be introduced is going to require a semester at a traditional district school before you can enroll in the program. And my question is, for states that do not currently have ESAs but are looking at possibly creating them, just what are your thoughts about the impact of that on parents who have already enacted some sort of choice, who have become disgruntled and have had issues with the traditional school system and decided to homeschool or decided to figure out a way to find the funds on their own to get their child into a private school, and then are possibly left out of this equation in the long run? And how do we address that so that we are actually serving all of the families that have these issues within the state?
We screwed up our statute. We're going to try and fix it. We did that same thing. And the reason we did it, well, the reasons are obvious, to make sure that they're already enrolled. But, and it sounded like it made sense at the time, but then go to a parents group and sit down and really talk to them about it. And, the parents that have made some pretty significant sacrifices, taking from their other children, as far as opportunities so that they can help their child who is starting out at a disadvantage reach their potential. So I don't know how politically you do it, other than you've got to sit down with your legislators. We've got to sit down with it in North Carolina and figure out how to get that out of there, because it's dramatic. It is a dramatic blow to a parent who has seen a light at the end of the tunnel, only to see the ultimate legislation come out and they're locked down. So.
And I think one of the arguments for having the students in the public school is for counting purposes. And I think for students with disabilities, you might also say you want to make sure they actually had an IEP ahead of time. But if you have the public school district do an evaluation and just have that as part of the legislation, that the student must have a publicly a public school district do the evaluation beforehand. You've got the kid counted by your public school, and they have the IEP prior to enrolling in the program. And so you're kind of getting, I think, the two purposes done without actually requiring enrollment.
And I think there's a way to address it with, you're talking about kindergarten and first grade, and we've done it in North Carolina. It's really the upper grades where the issue is. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this tends to be a political and budgetary consideration, but to Savant's point, most of these kids who enrolled in private schools are known to have disabilities by the districts already, and they've already gone through an evaluation process through the district because the federal IDEA requires what's called a child find process. And so they actually go out to private schools, most of those kids will have what's called an ISP, an individual services plan, because the district is required to spend a certain portion of their federal dollars to provide services to kids with special needs who are enrolled in private schools. So there already is a mechanism by which those kids are identified. They're not receiving state funds. The district is spending federal funds to provide them with certain services. But it's certainly not the case that, that it would be hard to identify those kids or know who those kids are ahead of time. And the reality is those families are making tremendous sacrifices to send those kids to those private schools.
And as we were just saying, they said homeschooled, and I was like, technically, they're still required
Yes.
to find you
Yep.
when you're homeschooled.
Yep.
I don't know how they find you other than going door to door, but the child find requirement is still technically in IDEA for the public schools, and they receive money to do it.
Yeah, I'm a father of four. All my boys are homeschooled, and certainly I'm in that community as well.
No one found you?
No one's found us, but a number of our friends and families have kids who are homeschooled who have ISPs. It's not uncommon, and they'll go to the district to receive speech therapy or occupational therapy or something along those lines. It's not an unusual occurrence at all. I see.
Hi, I'm Delegate Paul Espinosa. I chair the House Education Committee in West Virginia. We're exploring educational savings account legislation, looking at many of the same, I think, obstacles that you've had to overcome. You noted, and I tend to agree, that the program will help create a marketplace, and both Annette and Savan have talked a little bit about some of the initiatives in their areas. North Carolina doing anything specific to help spur that marketplace?
Not publicly. So I don't know if privately, once the program is off and running and is funded and we have more kids, I'm hopeful that the private markets will take care of that. There are some, again, my son goes part-time to the Hill School. They have a very limited enrollment because they can't scale. I think you'll start to see some of the models that have worked be replicated in other smaller jurisdictions once the funds become available, because these are kind of the dollars that we're talking about. One other quick thing, when I say we screwed up our statute, I forgot we're being filmed. But one issue for us is we have this disabilities grant, and sometimes that's a way to start. If you're on the disabilities grant and you're getting the $8,000 a year, you're not in the public school system, so you couldn't stack as what we had intended. So be careful when you start to have multiple programs that you really focus on making sure they dovetail together in the appropriate way.
So,
I also wanted to address New York City, while getting a lot of bad press for their special ed voucher program, it's just for services. So it really is functioning like an ESA where the district says, here's a voucher to go get speech therapy, find your service provider. They have tiered it to make sure that where there was a smaller marketplace, they were providing more money so that a market would form in neighborhoods where there was no speech therapy available.
so, and then Arizona, with its ESA program, pioneered a parent handbook, which I think has been really beneficial to parents in Arizona. So that's something other states can look at, is the Arizona handbook. And then we were also just shocked in Arizona to find out how tight-knit a community the special needs parents are. A Yahoo chat group developed very soon after the program was passed, and parents started talking to one another, sharing resources, ideas, educational options that other parents could take advantage of. And so the word got out there. I certainly think the administrators of the program should be working to do that as well. But it was really incredible to see the way the word spread quickly in Arizona. So I see a hand up in the back there.
I just want to say thanks to Senator Lee for admitting that your bill has a challenge or two. I know this is not a forum for comments, but I just feel compelled to say something while you're considering legislation in your state. I'm from Florida. We are a provider of services for families whose children participate in the Gardner Scholarship as well as the McKay Scholarship. I also serve as president of the McKay Coalition of Schools in Florida, and we are 100% committed to students with special needs. That's what we do. The challenge we're facing right now is families who come to us who would never put their children in a public school because of religious beliefs or because it's so emotionally traumatic for their child to go to a public school. It doesn't seem reasonable to me that they have to go and serve a year in a public system that's not going to serve their needs and is also going to traumatize them emotionally just so they can get the funding that as a citizen of that state is really rightfully theirs. And so I would just ask you to consider looking at some of the other models around the country before you go and you write your legislation. We are right now in Florida, we have introduced a bill in Florida to remove the prior year requirement for the McKay Scholarship. Because the number one concern we have is for those parents who come to us and say, I left too soon. My child couldn't take it any longer. And this federally required system of RTI has elongated the system for so long that after a year and a half, my child still can't get an IEP or 504. I just couldn't take it. My kid was shutting down on me. What am I to do? And so by requiring them to serve either a semester or a year in order for them to be entitled to this funding, even though they had a learning disability before they ever started school, is boy, something you really need to think about. So thank you, Senator, for being honest about that. And it's hard to go unwind that after you've already done it. And I apologize, but I've been doing this 19 years. I've been serving special needs kids. And I love the results of these programs and the kids whose lives have been changed forever. So thank you.
All right.
May I just make a little comment
Yes.
about that? I totally agree, and I talk to parents every single day that come in and say, I just can't put my child in a public school. They're going to suffer. Why would I do that as a human being and as a parent? So we got a little creative, and we have our students enroll in an online program, which is a public school program, and they're enrolled at Gateway also, so that they're able to do their 100 days, but they're under a safe, supported environment where they are doing both curriculums. And it's not overwhelming. So where there's a will, there's a way.
I will just comment, I believe in Florida, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that doesn't count, though. The Florida virtual school enrollment does not count
No, every state's
towards the
different.
scholarship, which is unfortunate. And another way around it, which is, with my nonverbal child, he went to charter school to get the IEP because it's specifically a school for children with autism. And then when he qualified, we moved him. So he has literally never been a day in public school, that particular child. My Gardner one hopped to public schools because of the IEP. Before being able, he had the McKay before. And some of you had mentioned some numbers, and you might say, well, why switch, or, why is one better than the other? Again, the needs are so different. I don't know if I mentioned the amounts before, but my middle one with nonverbal autism, Florida has a matrix, which used to be available. Apparently now it's very difficult to find this matrix level of services. He is a second to highest level. He gets almost $22,000 a year. Without that, we could not afford his private school, which is specifically for children on the spectrum, not high functioning. Other nonverbals. And then my little one gets, someone mentioned the $4,500. That's basically the threshold, the bottom. And there was another concern in the first strategy session we ran about diversity and pluralism. What can you do with that amount of money? Any little bit helps, and parents will do what they need to do to, make it work. But of course, the level of need for my child who gets $4,500, insurance can kick in, we'll make do, we'll make it work. But again, I would not be able to do what I do for my older boys with that amount of money. So the funding is very important, and specifically to the needs. Again, those categories are specific categories for a reason, because, that amount in Palm Beach County, the average Gardner is 10.5. So it's not the bottom of the barrel, it's not the highest, but for him, it's perfect. So you may want to keep that in mind as well.
Right.
Why one over the other, in addition to the fact that you can roll over from year to year the funds, which is a great advantage, and it's under the Florida Prepaid Program, the ESA, so technically you can do a 529 or put it into the Florida Prepaid, one of the other programs, which he has.
All right. I know there are other hands. Our time is about up, though. I think we have about 30 minutes before the next general session begins, so all of us should be available up here if you have additional questions. I was going to close with a story.
Can I just say one little thing?
Of course.
And I'm doing this because I've got a bunch of legislators in the room, and I'll do some lobbying here real quick. After you've fixed your ESA problem, you've got special needs worked out, K-12, that's awesome. Please don't forget what happens after they get out of school. You've got to look into the programs of how to transition children from school to something else, whether it's workforce, please, we've got a study committee, we're looking at it now. Please look at that. They're dropped off a cliff. They get on Social Security. You not only have a special needs adult now, you've got a co-occurring mental health issue because they're sitting around all day, every day doing nothing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, that's a pretty decent transition into my closing story.
Playing video games.
So I represented a young man named Austin Fox. Austin has high-functioning autism. He was in a public school that was doing everything the school could to meet his needs. They were bending over backwards. But as his mom told me, basically him sitting in a general education classroom with just the sights and sounds and murmurings that are going on in a room like this, to him was like walking into a Las Vegas casino. Just simply couldn't handle it. His senses were overwhelmed. He had a 2.0 GPA, and he was about to drop out as a sophomore, get his GED, and see if he could find a minimum wage job. Then Arizona passed the ESA program, and his mom said, will you please give this a shot? And so Austin went out and he found a small private Christian school that operated almost like a homeschool environment where students worked on their own with master teachers at their own pace. So if he needed help, he could get the help. But for the most part, he was just working on his own at his own pace in a quiet, dark setting, which was perfect for him. In 2 years' time, Austin went from a 2.0 to a 3.98. And because he had high-functioning autism under his IEP, he received $22,000 a year into his ESA, but he only spent $6,000 on tuition for those 2 years that he was in the private school, which means he was able to save all that money. In Arizona, we allow the student to save those funds and then use them for college. On Austin's SAT, he scored in the 98th percentile and was recruited to ASU Polytechnic. I can't think of another program that can take a student from a 2.0 GPA to a near 4.0 GPA in 2 years' time and allow them to save over $20,000 for college. It's a truly remarkable opportunity for my client Austin and for other students who are like him. So with that, we're going to close out, and like I said, we'll be here for questions.